Yeah.
Can I have your attention, please? Hello. I'd like to get started because it's already 5 after 8. We've got a busy day ahead of us and a whole busy weekend, actually. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Goodall, I'm the president of Warpstock. We've actually already been here for 2 days, but we didn't have any kind of an opening session. We went right into the classes. We try to fit as much information into the 4 days as we can. I'm trying. I guess the only announcement before I introduce our special guests for the weekend are that we have a survey here. I only printed up 50 copies this morning, so I think there's more than 50 people. I'll print up more later today. We'd like you to fill it out before you leave for the weekend. I know 1 or 2 people actually just coming for today. Most people will be leaving probably early tomorrow. Hopefully most of you can stick around at least till lunch tomorrow. Around 12 noon we're going to have a pizza party in, I believe, this room. And we'll also be having our giveaway session. We have a ton of stuff. Most of it.
So how many pieces of stuff?
There's about 170 items. So we'll be giving away 3 or 4 tickets. There's some special items. The way we'll work it is we'll give everybody about 5 tickets, so you'll have 5 chances to win something. As your name gets called out, you'll be able to pick an item. We'll have a printed list of all the items that we have, which I'll get to you later today. We ran out of paper. And you'll be able to pick off the items. So hopefully at least the first round, everybody should be able to get something that they're interested in. I can't bring any of it home. I've already been told by my wife. So it's all got to go.
The other thing is to decide, anyone who's taking digital photos, Julian, who just stand up, he's collecting photos for Warpstock.
So just put it on the
You can give him your card for it, so he can copy it or whatever, or he can give you his email address.
That's difficult because the USB connection on my laptop is broken. But you can email them to me, or you can burn them and give me a CD before you leave. jt@jt-mj.net.
We'll put a sign up in there. Also, if you have a compact flash card, you can give it to me. I have a compact flash card.
See if I can read.
And I can put them on my laptop and I can send them to you. Is there anything else? Yeah, there's a sign up. There's the dine around. It's not exactly working out the way we had planned because there's a big car show going on this weekend.
Understatement of the decade. The largest car
show in the world. I heard it happened to be this weekend. So most people think everybody's here for the car show. So the restaurants are going to be crowded. So you have to make reservations if you expected it to just be able to walk into a restaurant. That's not going to happen. There's a sign-up sheet. We're just going to be driving people. You can just, if you have a group, if you have your own car, you're welcome to go yourself. It's at the Hershey Lodge. This is supposed to be working on a map of directions.
It's only about 9 miles from here.
It's real close. You go up 283 to the 322 exit and go 322 east. And Hershey Lodge is right on I believe it's the left-hand side of the road. If you don't have transportation, there's sign-up sheets in the Elm Fir exhibit.
You haven't sat down and played with the computers there. You should.
Yes. Also, we have our own. If you just came in this morning, we have an OS2 museum down there where we try to assemble many old vintage PS2s, IBM computers down there with as many different versions of OS2 all the way back to 1.0 extended edition. I couldn't get 1.0 standard edition to install on the 50Z, but I just wouldn't do it. 1.0 extended did it. Okay, I guess we'll get started now.
Can't forget to mention there's an OS2 for PowerPC machine.
There is an OS2 for PowerPC machine downstairs. If you want to see what it looks like, since IBM didn't particularly want anybody to see what it looks like, we've got one here.
And OS2 TV.
And fascinating, from 15 years ago, we have a PS2 TV unit downstairs that will take broadcast TV and put it on your computer screen in either full screen mode or picture-in-a-picture. Considering that it was from 15 years ago, and you know, it's technology. I didn't even have picture-in-a-picture until just a few weeks ago. So we got a new one. It's too bad that I just. Okay. Enough of that. I'd like to introduce our main speaker for the weekend, Mike Kaply. I don't know if he really needs any introduction. Everybody should pretty much know him. He's the Mozilla guru, the chief in charge of Mozilla for OS2. He was for IBM when IBM actually was in that business. They seem to and he's still taking care of it for us. So I'd like to welcome Mike. And you have any start? Do you have an announcement you want to make?
Yeah, I'll do that at the end. We'll talk about that at the end.
Okay.
Okay. Well, hi everybody. My name's Mike Kaply. I've been doing OS2 since 1989. I started on OS2 1.1, working for IBM in Westlake, Texas, working on Office Vision 2, if any of you guys remember that, and an IBM product called Executive Decisions, which goes way back as well, back when executive information systems were big. So I've been doing this a real long time. A lot of people, you know, I'm a pretty young guy, but I was doing OS2 since I was 19, because it was what I started with co-op with IBM out of college. Since that time, I've done everything from support to, a lot of people know me because I worked for John Soering and did a lot of Team OS2 work in the late 80s, early 90s. Worked on the first developer connection, which was called the PDK, the Professional Developers Kit. Went on to work, then go to IBM full-time and work on the health system, did the tutorial for OS2 Warp 3. And from there, I was recruited onto the browser team. I actually started working on browsers on OS2 in 1996, starting with Netscape 202, and have been involved in every browser that IBM has produced since Netscape 202, and have led basically probably about 75% of all the browser releases that we've done. So what I want to do with this session was, I thought I've got a lot of stories and information and things, so what I thought I'd do for this session is kind of, we'll spend a little time going down memory lane, and I thought you guys might enjoy some trivia and some different stuff that I have from my time working on browsers. And then we'll talk about where the state of Mozilla and Firefox is today. And I want it to be kind of freeform, so if you guys have any questions for me, I have a lot of information about a lot of things. So if you guys want to know anything about anything, I probably can answer it or find it. And incidentally, a funny bit of trivia on the OS2 for PowerPC. I was very bummed because I found out a week before I contacted him, 12,000 copies of OS2 for the PowerPC were thrown away before I got a hold of him. Otherwise, I would have had a copy of OS2 for the PowerPC to give to everybody here, but I missed it by about a week because Scott Winters had been holding on to them for umpteen years, and finally there came to a point where everybody has all this stuff lying around, and they just trash it. So I know my copy of OS2 for the PowerPC I gave to, I don't know if they're here, but I sent it to somebody so that they could install it on and do the presentation, the paper about it. So that was my copy I gave away. So anyway, so I want to start by taking you guys a little bit through the history so you guys all know the stuff that we can flash back. This is the first web browser that was available on OS2. It was called Web Explorer. It was developed out of Raleigh, North Carolina by a small group. Basically, a lot of the work on this browser actually predates a lot of other browser work that was going on. This is a very early IBM project. And a lot of people raved about this particular browser on OS 2 because it was so multi-threaded. That was the main thing that people liked about it. And actually, the most interesting thing it could do, you can't really see it on the slow page, but down at the bottom it would actually show you the percentage of every thread and what it was doing within the browser. So this was interesting. This team actually, when they were first putting together this web browser, they were trying to come up with ways to short-circuit developing a web browser on OS 2. The funny connection with me and this browser was that when they were first looking at doing this, they were going to use the OS 2 help system as the web browser, using something called the dynamic data formatting facility within the help system that let you dynamically create content. So they actually contacted our team to see if that would be a useful way to do that. And I said, no, absolutely not. So they wrote this browser. The other thing a lot of people don't know is the reason this browser was actually ended up canceled in the end was when the frames specification came out, and these guys saw the frame specification. They said there's no way we could do frames inside of this browser without rejecting the whole thing from scratch. And so that happened, and then at the same point we started our negotiations with Netscape to do a browser on OS 2. So that's what killed Web Explorer. It still has one feature that I absolutely love, and someday I want somebody to write an extension to do it on Firefox, which is called the web map. Let me do some navigation to understand this if you haven't seen it. So the cool thing about the web map is that it actually shows you, so you can see the threads. It actually shows you an interactive view of how you navigate the web. So as a result, you can see branches. Like the biggest problem with navigating the web right now is that you go forward, and then you go back, and you go somewhere else, and then you can't go back and go forward again. And so the web map inside of Web Explorer actually solved that problem by showing you an interactive tree of how you surf the web. Very sweet feature, something that people still request to this day. And so someday, I'm sure somebody will write that into Firefox. Anyway, we'll get rid of Web Explorer now. Had a short lived. So that was followed up with Netscape 202.
What was the one with the ship? Yeah, the one with the ship. The one other one in there was never officially used to activate it.
I know the one you're talking about. I don't remember the name of it.
The web navigator?
I'm not sure. I saw a little bit about it when I was surfing around the web last night. Yeah, I don't remember that one. Okay, Netscape 202. This was an interesting project that happened with IBM. There was, obviously at the time that Warp 3 was coming out, there was a lot of interest in getting a browser, sorry, Warp 4. It's kind of in the middle there. Getting a browser on OS 2. So negotiations started happening with Netscape because at the time, the Netscape brand was what everybody wanted as the browser brand. What was interesting about what happened with IBM is that the negotiations were still going on, and they wanted to get started on the browser before we actually got the code. So what they did was they took a team out of Austin, I was not involved in this yet, and they had them look at the user interface for Netscape 202 and write the entire user interface using the open class libraries from Toronto, expecting that once we actually got the source code, we could just simply plug all of the back-end browser code onto the front end that these guys had written. And when I say written, I mean like workplace shell drag and drop for new. I mean, these guys basically looked at it and said, let's go overboard with using open class to do everything we can in this browser. And so when we actually got the source code from Netscape, we were like, no, there's just no way we'll be able to do a lot of this. So we actually ended up having to rip out a ton of the code that they'd written. Specific Mail News is a great example. I own Mail News for 202. That was my project. And they had done like full drag drop and using workplace shell to do news. But the thing is, if a news group had 500 items in it, it would create 500 workplace shell drag drop objects, and it was like, there's no way. And the open class would just like fall over when you were trying to do all that stuff. So we ended up having, but it's just a funny story of how, a lot of management people, not development people, decided, you know what, I'm sure it'll just connect if we, I'm just write the front end code, I'm sure we'll be able to make the magic happen. So, anyway, yeah, simple matter of programming. So that's what they did. So, anyways, we spent a lot of time. What's interesting about the other interesting things about 202 is we had some very heavy lifting helping us with this. It was a big deal at IBM. People like Lori Brown, who was one of the original leads on the Workplace Shell. You guys know the name David Kerr, who was another big OS2 guy. James Taylor, who I'll talk about in a minute, was involved in this. They basically were willing to bring in anybody they could to get this product ported. And then in the end, what happened was they grabbed a group of people and actually physically moved us out in California. And in the beginning, we traveled, California on the week, Austin on the weekends, because we were only allowed to work on the Netscape code on site. We weren't allowed to take any of it off. So they assigned us space, and we were working on this day and night out at Netscape trying to get the release out the door. So some of the cooler features about this, the one thing that everybody loves about this is the 202 had the best drag drop of any web browser that we created out of our team. And there's one reason why it had the best drag drop created out of our team. That's because James Taylor, who you guys might know, he was the lead architect on Workplace Shell. He passed away like a year ago. We'll talk more about him. He came out and he just went full bore. Like he was sitting there we were just coming up with new ways to use the drag drop on Workplace Shell to add comments to files and control shift to drag this and shift it. And so he just spent weeks just making up new ways to make the drag drop. And because this code was native OS2 code using OpenClass, we had a lot more flexibility for doing all that interesting stuff. So that's why the drag drop in 202 was so light years ahead of anything we still have to this day. So that was Netscape 202, a lot of work, very well received. The funny thing is if you try to use this browser today, I'm always amazed. Google.com is about the only web page that will still display in all of these browsers because they still design their web page to be displayed on this browser. But you basically can't do anything in 202 anymore. But there were a lot of companies, like corporate, that held on to 202 for dear life when we started coming out with Netscape 404 and 461. They just would not get off of this browser because everybody felt that this was faster than 404 and 461. And we couldn't figure it out because from a technical perspective, the code behind this is so much worse than anything else that we produce. But you guys know, a lot of people just fell in love with 202 and just wouldn't give it up until it just wouldn't serve the web anymore. So, any questions about Netscape 202? So, we'll go on to Netscape 404. Hopefully this will start. So, for 404, we basically had the flexibility to just start from scratch. For Netscape, the company, they had a release called 3.0 in between Netscape 202 and 4.0, which we didn't do. We can say that Netscape 202 was Netscape 3.0. Basically, for contractual reasons, we had to keep the versioning. We didn't want to change to Netscape 3.0 when there were some things going on behind the scenes. So what people didn't know is that Netscape 202 was actually a port of Netscape 3.0. It was not a port of Netscape 202. So once we went to Netscape 4.0, we actually got more money and more people, and we said, you know what, we can't reuse any of the code that we did, so let's just rewrite things from scratch. So back in those days, the way Netscape actually did their code is that they had 3 front ends, one for Mac, one for Windows, and one for Unix, and they didn't share any code at all from a graphics point of view, but they still have the same architecture they have today, which is there's this generic backend. So that you actually could do pretty good about writing, code for your platform and then connecting to cross-platform code on the backend. They actually have done that well for many, many years. And so that actually made our job a little easier because we'd already ported the backend, but we had to come up with a new way to do the front end. It just so happens that Netscape 4, the 4 series, was all rewritten by Netscape to use the Microsoft Foundation classes. If you guys know anything about porting code to OS2, that's like the worst set of code you could ever have to port code to OS2 is the Microsoft Foundation classes. So, little known to the whole world, and we're probably the only people that have it, is we wrote a version of the Microsoft Foundation classes for OS2. It was obviously tailored to what we did, but we had a person on our team by the name of Todd Crow. And Todd was one of the original developers of the DAX, the Open32 API, and he was brilliant when it came to understanding Windows events and all this kind of stuff. So we actually spent months figuring out all the open Microsoft Foundation classes that were used within Netscape 4, and we ported the code so well, as far as we're concerned, that we were willing to contribute our code back to Netscape with the OS2 changes if def did the code. We didn't even have to have an OS2 tree. We were actually to do all of our OS2 changes by if defing the Windows code. So it was quite an undertaking, and the end result was that Netscape 404 was actually pretty much the same as the Windows version of Netscape 404, with the exception of drag and drop, which, because we chose to emulate the Microsoft Foundation classes, there was no way we could do the kind of drag and drop that we did on Netscape 202. So the 404 drag drop was very klooched together, involving manually creating items on the desktop, and very, very ugly things. But the cool thing about that was that because we did 404, it made us easier to move to 461. But one more story about 404 that is a good one. So obviously with any product, you're coding for bring up. And so when we first brought up 404, it was on my machine and we started it, and it just sat there cranking away. And we said, no, it's just something, it's taking too long. So we finally killed it and looked, and half of the directories on my hard drive were gone. Because what had happened was, when 404 first came up, the first thing it tried to do was profile migration. And the way it does profile migration back then was it would find the directory where the profiles were, and then it would wipe out what was there and redo a migration. And we had written that wrong. So it found my root directory as its profile manager. And it really did wipe out half of my hard drive before we killed it and figured out that that's what it done. So anyway, that was kind of a funny thing. Yeah, we always have backups of that stuff. It was all checked in. So now 404 was interesting. Otherwise, it's because I moved to California, and we had a team that was fully staffed by Netscape and IBM working on browsers at that point in time. So that was really cool. We actually had Ted DeCastro from Netscape, and we had a guy named Martin Mornett who worked on the original Acrobat Reader for OS2 over at Adobe. We had Todd Crow. We had Bill Law, who was actually one of the original developers of the IBM Open Class libraries. We had a lot of guys that had a lot of OS2 experience. So we lived there. I had set up so we had satellite TV, in our offices. We spent all of our time out there at Netscape. It was a lot of fun. But from an IBM perspective, they felt like we were getting a little disconnected, let's put it that way. A little too freewheeling out there. So IBM worked hard to negotiate with Netscape to get us into Austin, Texas, because they wanted to have a little more control over the project. So a lot of negotiations went on, and we were finally able to move back to Austin and do Netscape 461. Austin was interesting because in order for the contract with Netscape to be fulfilled, we had to have our lab had to be secured and have a connection back to Netscape, not to IBM. So we were actually in a locked room inside of IBM in Austin, but our internet connection physically was routed. It was a T1 at that point. A T1 routed directly back to Netscape Communications for getting our actual internet connection. So it was kind of a strange situation where we were this little island inside of IBM, and all of our connections were routed through IBM. Now, of course, the bonus of that is that we didn't get any IBM firewall or protection, so we had full access. We had better access to the internet in our lab than the rest of the IBM site did at that point in time. So that's good. So we actually had to go to a separate machine to do all of our IBM stuff because we were only connected to Netscape. So we had more great people coming on board at that time. Some of the big changes for 461 were changes to the way we did Java integration. We did a lot more work with getting Java. Actually, Java integration inside of the OS2 version of Netscape was better than anything anybody else had done with integrating Java in a browser up to that point in time. We had pluggable JVMs before anybody even thought of the idea. We actually owned most of the patents on pluggable JVMs as a result of that. So that was a lot of great work that was done. That was, when Netscape 461 happened, that was about the same time that a lot of the real big IBM Java work was going on with Java OS and all those other ideas that people had. So we worked a lot with those teams to do that work. So 461 was also interesting because one of the things that we're famous for is that every version of the browser we've shipped, we've put in a big bug at the last minute with everything that we've shipped. 461 was no exception. Bonus points to anybody who can remember what the bug of 461 should be. It was that if you didn't have WinOS 2 installed, you couldn't see form controls. Because at the last minute, we changed the default font for form controls to be Courier New instead of Courier, not realizing that there were people out there that didn't install WinOS 2, so we got a lot of heck for that one. But unfortunately, I know it happened with 202 and 4042, exactly the same situation. I was always blamed for putting that last bug in, so. Let me bring up 461. One of the other things, you guys might not have seen this, but let's see if 461 comes up. 461 was the first browser we actually put an Easter egg into. It's still kind of humorous to say. Oh, we'll talk about the links menu real quick before I get there. This is kind of funny. So everybody thought the links menu was there for their convenience, but the links menu was only added for voice type. I mean, it was basically, that's the only way you could say all the links on the web pages. Was by putting them in the menu. We had a great person named Sherry who came in and did all of our voice type integration. So again, we had amazing voice integration before everybody else did. So, and here you get a good picture of. We had a ton of people on the team. I think it's just an amazing group. But the Easter egg here was that if you clicked on our name on the core development team, it started a little race that raced everybody's name across the screen. So we would actually sit in the lab and have, who's going this time? Who's going this time? And you see down here, it's actually giving status as the lead changes. Jeff jumps in the lead, Jeff fills in the gap. Up.
Let's have a lot of spare time.
Jeff Jones is the winner.
When you're
Jeff Cobal at a distant second place. So that was our one value-intensive Easter egg back when JavaScript was just coming into play big time. So that was kind of fun. So we had a lot of fun doing a lot of this stuff. A lot of people involved. Obviously, back in the time when IBM was really interested in getting browsers on OS 2. So unfortunately, things aren't the same. So. Anyway, I don't have a copy of IBM web browser installed on here, but that's where we go from there. Okay. So basically, there was a point in time when Netscape decided they were going to give away their source code. And what's interesting is that we were actually in California when a lot of that work started out. So we were actually able to get a lot of the OS 2 source code on the back end put into the Mozilla release before it actually happened. So that was kind of cool. So a lot of when this work started happening, there were people there was code that was already there. But our team continued down the Netscape path for a while there were external people that were working on doing the OS 2 browser. As a matter of fact, a lot of the people that were doing the early OS 2 browser work were people like Bill Law and Dan Libby, who were people that were on our team working on Netscape, but because of their affiliations with the company Netscape, they could do more work on that code than we could, because we hadn't gone through all the legal stuff to get that to happen. So we were all focused on Netscape 461. You guys, we had customers deploying the stuff. We were on site at customers fixing bugs. This code was pretty well distributed, so that's where we spent all of our time. And then at a future point, IBM finally decided that we were going to jump on the Mozilla bandwagon, and so we decided to take the Mozilla source code and get it over on OS 2. It had been done by a team outside of IBM, but it hadn't been modified or updated in a long while, so we basically had to redo a lot of the work that they did. At that time, we weren't sure that Netscape was going to keep going down the path that they were going down. So we had to make a decision as to whether or not we were going to continue to pay Netscape for the right to use their name and source code, which, obviously that's what was happening. There was a contract with them. Or whether or not we wanted to go it out on our own and drop the Netscape name. At that point in the industry, the Netscape name didn't have the same play that it did in the industry, so we decided to just go for it. And that was my decision, and whether or not that was the right decision or not is debatable from a historical point of view. If you really look at all the IBM web browser releases, what you'll find is that they corresponded exactly to the Netscape releases behind the scenes, right down to the branch of code that they were on. They just weren't called Netscape. So that helped, because in the long run, our customers all wanted a browser that corresponded to something on Windows that we could tell them about. So they didn't like the fact that there would be an IBM browser on OS 2 that we could say, oh, this is the same as Netscape 6 on Windows. This is the same as Netscape 6.2 on Windows. So in the end, we ended up matching up all of our browser releases to Netscape releases anyway. And the way you could tell that was that IBM Web Browser 1 was Netscape 6, and IBM Web Browser 1 was Netscape 6.1, and IBM Web Browser 1.2 was Netscape 6.2. So all of our releases ended up matching up with Netscape releases. So, and incidentally, in case you guys are curious as to why the numbering of the releases are so wacky, especially as it came to IBM Web Browser, like why it's 404 and it's always stayed 404, and why it's 461 it's always stayed 461. Well, it's because within IBM, corporate customers do not like getting new versions of things. So what you do is you leave the version number the same, and then you update it behind the scenes with all the new stuff, but you give it to the customer and tell them it's still Netscape 461, and they think that they're just getting a service release behind the scenes, but in actuality they're getting all kinds of new code, and they just don't realize it. So,
This is being taped.
that's it. IBM Web Browser is the biggest culprit on this. I mean, since well, I don't even know the versioning numbers because we'll talk about that. India's doing a lot of it now, but these have been major releases that they've been doing for the past 3 years. I mean, they're updating to the latest version of Mozilla code, but from a service perspective, they're being labeled as, you know, a .o release. They're labeled as service releases, but they're major code updates. That's kind of fun. The other funny thing is the naming of IBM Web Browser. Is this super good information for you guys? Do you find this?
Yeah.
All right, I can talk about what Mozilla is doing, but I thought I might as well share with you guys all this stuff that goes around in my head all the time. So the IBM Web Browser is an interesting naming situation. We had a naming contest to name what we were going to call the IBM version of the browser. I think I posted the results when they first happened many years ago. The winner was Bluezilla. We actually gave an award to that, like a prize to that person. Some of the other names it came up with was Sad Lizard, because a blue Mozilla would be a sad lizard. The funniest name was a friend of mine came up with the Big Kahuna browser, and we still joke about that to this day, you know, about the Big Kahuna. But Bluezilla won it, and so we took it forward to the executives and we're like, we think we should call it Bluezilla, and they looked at us and said, no, web browser, IBM web browser. Just call it that. So that's why it's called the. I can tell you personally, John Sawyering made the decision to call it the IBM web browser, and I remember when it was like they just didn't want it. So it's like it's the IBM web browser for OS 2. It's just we're going to call it. No, Bluezilla. Nobody will understand what that means. It needs to be called what it is, a web browser, the IBM web browser. So that's why we have the most boring name on the planet for the IBM web browser for OS 2. So that's the story behind that. But we had a lot of fun working on the IBM web browser, and working with the community, and really getting into Mozilla, and actually getting to get back into doing a lot of new stuff on OS 2. And we actually did a lot. There was a lot of work that went on to make what the Mozilla code work really well on OS 2. And I feel like the fact that things have held up so well to this date, I mean, what that team did in the beginning in terms of getting really has stood the test of time. A lot of the code that, if you go all the way back, we can talk about people like John Fairhurst and Henry Sabatka and those guys that did a lot of the work in the beginning. And we worked very closely with their team, taking that code and then, doing as much as we could. But a lot of that code still is the original code that was done by that team on OS 2. So that was IBM Web Browser. Now, the situation with IBM Web Browser was we had to maintain the open source code because otherwise IBM Web Browser couldn't exist, obviously. That was very hard to explain to executives, by the way. They have a lot of trouble understanding that, well, can't we just work on IBM Web Browser? Well, if we don't work on the open source part, then there won't be any code for IBM Web Browser to use when we create it. Well, but can't we just do the IBM code? You're not understanding. So convincing managers to do things like, public nightly builds and, back when we had tinderboxes which showed the build status, those were very, very difficult negotiations to go through with management, trying to get them to understand that, if we make the open source part happen, then we will get the IBM stuff for free. And so, I mean, the funny thing is how well this has worked over time. In the very first release of IBM Web Browser, and actually, I'll show you a little bit of this. So if anybody ever actually read the README that came with their IBM web browser, which nobody does, they would actually realize that the source code that builds IBM web browser is available freely on the web. So this is a historical record of all the work that we did. Hey, I didn't think about this. This is a great way to get cakes. So the first version of IBM web browser was released on August 8, 2001. Yeah.
Zoom that up.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so this web address, legally, I'm sorry, that's the first version of IWB. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so legally we're required to put all the source code changes that we make out to open source when we ship a new browser. So this is a record of every version of IBM web browser that's ever shipped, starting with IWB 1112, then 2.0, 2.01, 2.3. And you'll see that even when the India guys released their new version this year, they put their version out. And what you can see from this, which is really cool for my purposes, is our first version was 1.5 meg. Unfortunately, IWB 1.1 was 2.6 meg. And then 1.2 was 1.3. You see it getting smaller, and by 2.05, you see it's 398 kilobytes. So this was what we were trying to explain to IBM. This shows it very, very well, which is that over time, what the IBM web browser became was just an IBM logo and a couple other things tacked on top of the code that Mozilla released, with a couple of very specific fixes for some very specific customers in the code. So it was kind of cool that our goal over time was that the IBM web browser would become less and less work over time. That was kind of what we were trying to argue to our management group, is that over time, this is going to be really, really easy, because the more we participate in the open source side of things, the more you're just going to get a web browser on OS for free. So now, along this route, we tried multiple times to convince them that we shouldn't even bother doing IBM web browser anymore. Just let the customers take Mozilla. They don't need to even know there's an IBM web browser. It's the same code behind the scenes. We're doing twice the work here. But in the end, because customers like the name IBM, and they like being able to pick up the phone and call people, the idea of being able to ship a browser that said IBM that we could actually offer support for was the reason why we kept doing IBM web browser, and still do it to this day, although I've been sworn that this is the last release of IBM web browser this year. But of course, I was also sworn that with 2.02 and 2.03. Every year they keep prolonging the inevitable. But the latest one that's actually this is, I'm trying to think, I think they're working on, well, the one they're doing right now, I think, is just some custom stuff. We have 2 customers left that use IBM web browser, which are HSBC and Deutsche Bank. Those are the only 2 customers that still use IBM web browser on OS. Anyway, this is a fun resource if you guys were ever curious about the different things that went into making the IBM web browser. What you'll find with a lot of them is it's backporting of fixes that we needed for specific customers, and there's a couple of unique things for customers inside of it. We added kiosk mode inside of our OS2 browser, which the regular browser didn't have because we had a specific customer that wanted kiosk mode. We added the ability to turn off this very crucial dialogue that told you when you were doing some very insecure stuff, but we had a customer that didn't want that dialogue to show up, so we gave them the ability to turn off that dialogue. And some other little things. One of these versions even has a preference specifically for HSBC that if you turn it on, it makes printing work the way it did in IWB 1.0, because when they went to 2.0, it broke their printing. So we actually put all of the old printing code back in and gave them a preference they could turn on to make it print the old way. Because they had actually done all their printing infrastructure to specifically rely on the way tables separated in IWB 1.0. So that's the worst part about this situation, is that these in an open source perspective, things are changing all the time behind the scenes. So, we joke about the fact that customers want things to stay the same, and we're giving them a 2.04 and a 2.05. but there are major changes happening behind the scenes. So with every release, it would be, oh, this thing I was doing broke, and this thing I was doing broke. And so the next, we're actually putting together, well, thank you, team, is actually having to bring some fixes that we back out of the main open source stream, put them back into IOV specifically for a customer, because we felt they were unstable for the community, but this particular customer needs those fixes really bad. So that's what the life is like in India. So about 3 years ago now, we actually moved the IBM web browser development over to India. Basically, all of the development for all of our browsers has moved to India at one point in time. And because we're videotaping, I'm not going to actually share any of my opinions.
Turn it off.
That's one I can't do. But I think people tend to have a lot of negative, feeling about, what that means for products or what that means. But what most people have to understand is that for us, it just relieves a burden is what the end result of it. I mean, when they moved Netscape 4.6.1 to India, what it meant was that we could go work on Mozilla and we could go work on the IBM browser. Whereas before that, we were spending, literally, I had people on my team that would spend 3 to 4 months a year physically gone at customer sites doing 4.6.1 support. And so, at the time, a lot of us were, you really feel like, well, my job's going away, what am I going to do now? But the reality is, at least for our purposes, there were other things that were awaiting us. So we worked really hard to make sure that the transition to the India team went really smooth, and obviously it was part of my job to make sure that that happened. And so we moved all of the browser support to India, and the IBM web browser, the last 3 IBM web browser releases have actually come from the India team with support from a project management team based in Austin. And so I've been reasonably hands-off. I only get involved when we have major customer critical situations or when there is open source interaction that they need more information about. And so, I mean, there are good guys out there. Unfortunately, they do have a high turnover rate, so a lot of the guys that we had that really know the IBM source code in and out aren't there anymore, so more and more stuff is starting to come our way. But like I said, supposedly this release is the last IBM web browser release, and to come out of India. So the one thing that we haven't been able to do well is get that team to work more on the open source side of things. So that's why, even though there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with IBM web browser and those guys knowing that code, most of the work they do doesn't make it back into the open source community. Occasionally you'll see an in.ibm.com address doing something with a bug in Bugzilla, and those are the OS2 India team working on IBM web browser in India. Okay, so that is a walk through the history of browsers on OS2 as IBM produced them. Does anybody have any questions about history or, yeah?
Couple of names.
Barbara Walters was on the original Web Explorer team. The Web Explorer team was actually, the code was created in Raleigh, but there were parts from research in Endicott and a couple other places. Basically, the Web Explorer was written as 5 different modules. I still have all the source code for Web Explorer on my machine at work, actually. We actually occasionally have had to reference it many years ago, so I still have it. But like there was a JPEG library that was written by a group within IBM, and then the networking piece was written by one group. So yeah, it was a lot of different, and Barbara Walters is one of the names. Actually, I ran into somebody just like 3 or 4 weeks ago on the phone who was talking about the fact that they knew me from the original Web Explorer work that they did. So yeah, that was, I mean, at the time it was a big deal. They got a lot of research people together from a lot of different places to put together Web Explorer.
Also, you mentioned James Taylor.
James Taylor.
Was he originally out of Montreal?
James Taylor was not originally out of Montreal. He's always been in Texas.
That's another James.
This James Taylor worked out in Westlake, Texas. He worked on Office Vision 2. He was the lead architect for the Workplace Shell. He worked in Boca doing shell development, and then he ended up back in Austin working for IBM, doing contracting work. But basically, he's the father of the Workplace Shell. He basically came up with pretty much all of it. So, and obviously a great team supporting him, but he's the lead architect. Yes?
What about when you changed compilers? Was that a big project?
Changing compilers. Oh, I'd forgotten about that. Thank you for reminding me of that lovely You know, when we were using Visual, the IBM compiler, we were the last group that was using the IBM compiler still. We actually had a support contract with Toronto specifically to support us doing the compiler. The saddest part about that is that if you know anything about compilers, Toronto still does the Visual Age compiler. They still did at that point in time. And the OS2 front end of the compiler was the OS2 back end actually, was a very small thing. Most of the compiler code that Toronto did was actually cross-platform compiler code. They refused to make that code work on OS2. So we spent most of our time reporting optimization problems in the Visual Age compiler. And there got to a point where it was like, the code was exercising it so bad that we were finding optimizer bugs. And then Mozilla started relying on interesting features of the C language that required us to just have to give up on the Visual C++. Believe it or not, the hardest part about switching compilers had nothing to do with the technical aspect of switching compilers. It had to do with the legal aspects of switching from an IBM compiler to an open source compiler that was under the GPL. That was actually the hardest thing about switching compilers. So we had to, the main thing was that they didn't understand that, the biggest problem on OS2 is that the OS2 compiler has to actually physically ship bits of code from the compiler for the stubs for doing executables and DLLs got shipped as part of your product. And the lawyers are arguing that that's technically taking open source code and shipping it. And anyway, very painful process. The code, because the code from Mozilla was so designed to compile on other compilers already, it actually getting it to compile was somewhat painful, but not as painful as it could have been. The legal process was actually the worst. So, and then obviously, explaining to everybody how everything builds differently. And if you go to build this up to, I don't know the version off the top of my head, but obviously there's a point at which it will only build with the IBM compiler. There's a short period of time where it will build with both compilers, and then from then on it'll only build with GCC. So yeah, that was believe it or not, there's obviously technical hurdles to get over in this, but my team was playing in the open source world long before a lot of IBM was playing in the open source world, certainly publicly. We might have been doing a lot of things behind the scenes to set up a lot of the stuff that we're doing now with Linux and things like that. But our team was very open in the open source thing. And the only thing that saved us from getting clobbered by management was the fact that we were working on OS2. And if you know anything about the history, obviously everybody knows everything about the history behind OS2, you'll know that despite any Microsoft legal wranglings that they might want to do, OS2 is kind of in a protected state from that. And so we didn't have a lot of the worries that other open source projects did in terms of shipping and doing interesting things. I'm trying to be very generic in terms of my discussion of the subject. So basically, we could do a lot. OS2 could do a lot more with open source than anybody else within IBM can at that point in time. So we had a lot more flexibility, which was cool. So OS2 was under the radar as far as the lawyers were concerned, which is why we were able to get away with a lot of things.
Did you try that 4.0 compiler as another route?
We did try to do Visual Age 4.0 as another route. The biggest problem with Visual Age 4.0 is they got rid of the command line utilities. So there was a point at which somebody actually, I believe, got it up and running at 4.0, but it just wasn't, we couldn't automate the builds like we could with the GCC or IBM. The other funny thing about the IBM stuff is that we actually finally, so to do the GCC port, we needed a linker. And so we actually got the source code with the linker from, well, we had the linker. The linker belongs to, let's see. The linker originally went to OS2. We shipped that code to Toronto. They created an iLink based on the Link 386 code. And then we convinced them to give it back to us so that we actually could put fixes into the linker on top of it. And that's how we were able to then ship a linker, ship the standalone linker on top of OS2 to be able to use the IBM linker with GCC. So there was a lot of negotiations that went on with that to make all that happen. Any other?
So that compiler works pretty well with
The GCC compiler works great. I haven't run it we don't run any problems with that. I like it at debug. The other big problem is debugging. Unfortunately, the debugger that works the best with GCC, I've still never got permission to give out. Although there are people that have that debugger, but they'll remain nameless. Anybody who wants that debugger, well, anyway. The debugger was originally done for obviously for IBM compilers, and there were some issues with it, and somebody managed to get a hold of the code. I don't remember his name, but there was a guy who got a hold of the source code of the debugger and made it work better, and as a result, we were able to continue that work, and actually, I still have the source code of that debugger sitting around somewhere. There are other people that have the source code of that debugger, but we won't go to that either. Yeah, that was the biggest problem, was in the beginning, GCC didn't play well with the IBM debugger, but fixes in GCC as well as fixes in the debugger solved that problem.
So which debugger do you use?
I use iDebug. It's an internal use only version of iDebug. You can still use the version of iDebug that came with any of the Visual H tools, and it worked reasonably well. But if you desperately need to debug Mozilla Firefox source code, you can contact me, and we can find you a debugger. We tried forever to being able to ship the linker. I mean, the hurdles we had to jump through to get the linker out of the work was nightmarish, because the toolkit folks didn't want to relinquish anything. So the debugger, I could never get permission to ship. So if you really need it, I mean, it's at this point I'm not really stressed about it anymore. It's like nobody's gonna get over it. But if you really need a debugger that works well, it's called the JIT debug. The coolest thing about it, which was never shipped, was it actually, well, I'll say supports. Occasionally it works. It actually supports invoking the compiler when your application crashes, which was a feature that everybody wanted inside the OS2 debugger, but nobody ever got. So it installs a device driver. When you crash, it'll say you want to invoke the debugger. And 9 times out of 10, it'll bring down your whole system. That 10th time, yeah.
Have you tried to do any work on this source code using the Open Watcom project?
Open Watcom. When we first started working on this source code in the very beginning, we were waiting patiently for the Open Watcom source to get released, because our original plan was to use Open Watcom instead of IBM to do all of our work. But it just kept getting delayed, and back then it had requirements that you had to actually have a copy of Watcom in order to get the downloads that fixed Watcom, and in the end it was just too much pain to actually make it work. So has anybody tried lately to even see if it compiles with Open Watcom? I mean, the build environment for Mozilla is a very flexible build environment. So I would wager that somebody could get it building. I mean, I just don't know what it would look like in the end. But I mean, GCC is just supported so well, and it's just working very well. That's another funny bit of GCC trivia, actually. IBM was so concerned about using an open source compiler that we actually contracted with an exec to support us on GCC, and we actually were a revenue stream for them to. We paid them basically to be on call. Yeah. Yeah, it was great. They basically sat around for a year doing nothing, getting paid not. No, we used that money. No, the coolest thing that came out of that money wasn't just about the compiler. The iPlugin work that you see for running Java, that was a specific thing that they did as a result of the IBM relationship. And I have to tell you guys, that is an amazing piece of work. If you don't understand what the iPlugin stuff does, what it allows you to do is it allows you to use both the IBM JVM with either a GCC or a Visual H compiled Mozilla. And so it actually does mapping of Visual H and GCC calling conventions behind the scenes, and it understands the internals of Mozilla so that it can handle when entry points change, and it's an absolutely brilliant piece of work that they did. And the funny thing is, there have been people that want to do that exact same thing, and they haven't been able to figure out how to do it, because they want to make it so that, like AIX was a case where they wanted to figure out how to make different application binary layers work with Mozilla. It's a brilliant piece of work. And so that's actually what's the bulk of what we paid them for, was to get IBM.
I mean, that's just great, because we didn't want to do the details.
Yeah, that was what it was. Yeah, originally what we were going to have to do was implement all of the Visual H tables inside of GCC, because we needed Java to work. But they came up with this much better idea of doing API mapping on the fly.
What we don't know about that one is that that's what we use for all our projects as well.
They said that they use that for all the.
It does the Microsoft contributions.
Okay, so you guys, so when you port Flash, you don't have to do anything to support the IBM, the calling convention, because you map the Microsoft calling convention under the cover. So, anyway, it's a very nice piece of work. So anyway, so we actually paid for GCC support. We found some optimizer bugs along the way, and a few.
We made.
So that code is all out of, you can just get all the code for that compiler?
The GCC compiler? Yeah, it's all open source, and you upload that source on the Innotech website, the source code of the compiler.
Yeah,
So.
search code is from the level soon,
Okay. It's going in the NetLabs repository for you. Yeah.
My question with regard to the iPlugin was, what is the exact reason that can't be bundled with package?
Okay, I'm going to tell this story. Okay, the code belongs to IBM. We paid for it. But Innotech really didn't want us to release it as open source. They really pleaded with us not to make that code available because they felt that, and I'm going to say the same thing. I mean, I'll be honest, it's really a brilliant piece of work. I mean, and so they didn't feel that that was code that they just wanted to give away to the world. So they pleaded with us to not make that code open source. And so we said, you know what, that's cool. So basically, iPlugin is built, it's not even built by us anymore. Originally, we built it as part of our source tree, we shipped it, but in the end, we decided to just let Innotech build it and let IBM customers go to Innotech to get it done. So the answer is, it is wholly owned by IBM. Tomorrow, I could go to IBM and get that code shipped as open source if I wanted to, but, I'm sorry? Oh, do you guys want it shipped as open source now?
I asked something about it, but
All right. Well, that was back then, you guys, so.
yeah, because I mean, the idea was back then that we were doing this kind of supporting the plugins already. I not actually more plugins coming out.
Yeah, we need
asked us for those two plugins.
Yeah, we meet next week, and we can get that open source.
Yeah, just take a minute.
It'll be fun to find the original contract though, because a lot of those people moved around on their jobs. But yeah, if you guys want to release it now, that would be cool. Yes, we do. There seems to be a trend here. There was a time when we thought we would have to actually sit there at our desk with a lawyer standing behind us watching us as we But things are much better now. We have a lot of fun in my team. So let's talk about the president. I'm going to talk a little about what I do now, just for your guys' information, and we'll talk about what goes on some participation. So my job, I have a team, and our job is to basically feed IBM's participation in the open source community. And what we do is we look out for IBM's best interests within the Mozilla community, and we contribute technologies that are important to IBM. So my primary job, obviously, as you guys know, is not OS2 anymore. I still have an OS2 machine at work. If you were to come to my office, you would see that I have two screens. One that is always OS2 that I can switch to, and so whenever anything comes up, I can do that. So at one point, I actually did get rid of all my OS2 machines at work, and I realized it just wasn't going to hack it, so I brought one back. So I still use OS2 at work. So my team does things like Xforms. If you know anything about Xforms technology, we're contributing that to Mozilla, and SVG, which is scalable vector graphics, which I'll get into the OS2 side of that in a minute. So it's a cool job. I get to I travel out to California and talk to the Mozilla team. I've been involved in the Mozilla community for a very long time, longer than most. So everybody pretty much knows who I am. So the OS2 platform actually has a little bit of competition. There are people that are looking out for us. And people I that I was able to meet somebody up about last week. I think things are progressing pretty well, and I'll try to allocate more home time, more of my personal time to, once every 3 months, 18 months, or work on OS2, which is things like that. So one of my goals for this coming years is to try to figure out how I can do a little more of my work time on OS2 to try and keep things going. Because the thing, it's still kind of important because there are still people that need it. So, but we have a good time. We still are very active in the community, and everybody still knows me as the OS2 guy. And they don't give me as much of a hard time as they used to. But we've continued on OS2 to, be as much on the cutting edge of Mozilla as we could. I mean, in terms of, Firefox being available on OS2, CMonkey being available on OS2. If you don't know, basically, at this point, Mozilla proper has decided they're not going to do the suite anymore. They're just going to do Firefox and Thunderbird. And SeaMonkey is what the community is calling the suite that they're going to produce of mail news all bundled together. It all works on OS 2, comes up fine. We've got great guys in the community like Andy Willis and Rich Walsh and Peter Weilbacher and doing development work, which is awesome. They can relieve a lot of the burden that I have. Rich puts together some amazing fixes on OS 2 stuff that I would never, that when I touch that code, I broke it every time. So having somebody else break it every time is much better. The focus code is the most miserable piece of code. And anybody that works on Mozilla will tell you that the focus code is as bad as it gets. And so the platform-specific focus code is even worse than the cross-platform focus code. And then Felix Miata, Mr. Mazda on IRC, is always around helping with testing and things like that, and keeping me honest in terms of when my builds aren't uploading and things like that. So Andy's actually here, and I don't know if any of the other guys are here because some of them I've met. So anyway, so things are moving along. So the next major step in Mozilla's world is that there's this technology called Cairo, which is a cross-platform graphics layer that they're going to move the whole browser to eventually. So right now we have platform-specific code that draws lines and draws text, and they're trying to make it so that we interface with this application or this thing called Cairo, so that it removes a lot of this platform-specific code from Mozilla and moves into this thing called Cairo. And so that there's actually something porting Cairo to OS 2. Unfortunately, they're using OpenWatcom, which makes it a little difficult to integrate it with Mozilla because of the calling conventions, the same problems we always have on OS 2. But that work isn't going down. So what that means is that when they make that switch at some point in the future, we'll still have a browser on OS 2 because the outlook for we call it tier 1 browser, which is Mac, Windows, and Linux browsers, is not very good once they make that switch, because what they've basically done is added another library that needs to be ported on your platform. I feel pretty confident that we'll get there, and that there are people that care enough about this stuff that it'll get ported to OS 2 and we'll continue to have OS 2 browsers. Golly, forever? I just don't know anymore. I have this shirt that I wish I brought that says, it was the Convenience Pack 2 release shirt, where it says, the absolute last release of OS 2, this time we mean it, really, we swear. And then on the back it says, until next year. The same, these things are going to keep going, and obviously as long as people use OS 2, things will continue to move forward. And we've got a lot of great people working on browsers to help us out, and so things will keep going. We're continuing to upload nightly builds so that people can keep grabbing new builds. There are some persistent bugs that have been around that I'm hoping to find some time to try to solve. In general, when I use Firefox on OS 2, there are times when, because I'm so familiar with the debugging environment on OS 2, if I run into a cross-platform problem, I'll actually go ahead and just debug it on OS 2. Because honestly, I don't like Microsoft's Developer Studio debugger. I just don't think it's, if it's all you've ever used, it's great, but because it's so, takes over the system, and it's just not, I just love the OS 2 debugger. So that's something that happens where people will come to my office and be like, what are you working on OS 2 for? And it's like, well, actually it's a Windows bug, and I'm just debugging it on OS 2 because it's easier to do, and I like that environment a little better. So anyway, so we still do that. And actually, a lot of the code we work on, we actually did build the Xforms code on OS 2 just for fun to make sure that it would still work, and it does. SVG works on OS 2. Andy Lewis over here has done a lot of work on that. And then a lot of the other stuff we do is cross-platform. So it's just going to work on OS 2. So, yeah.
How many people use it?
How many people use it? I haven't seen the download numbers. I can get the download numbers from Mozilla, but I haven't lately. The last time I checked it, it was. I believe the numbers were like 8,000, 9,000. They were high enough to be, respectable. There are quite a bit of still a lot of Japanese users of OS 2, and so that's a big thing. But I think we get enough people using it. I think it's worth keeping it around. I think we've got more people using it than VOS. The VOS port is still alive and well. So the next step in Mozilla's world then is besides the Cairo. There's one other. Oh, by the way, I was using virtual PC to do all that, so let me figure it out. Because I'm sorry, but I don't run OS2 on my laptop. I know. So there's this new technology called Zool Runner. You guys have ever heard of it? Basically, one of the biggest problems with Firefox is that it's not embeddable. So you can't have an application that uses Mozilla as the rendering engine inside of your application, because Firefox is a static code, it's just a giant. So they're moving toward this thing called libzool and Zool Runner, which is basically a better way to embed Mozilla and then a way to write applications that don't require the browser. So you guys probably have Firefox and you install a zillion extensions and they do all kinds of interesting things. But the end goal for Mozilla is that people view Mozilla as an application platform, not as just a web browser. So this idea with Zool Runner is that you could write an application that was standalone and could run, but it didn't need the browser to run. It was using browser technology behind the scenes, but the application itself just looked like a normal application, and nobody would know that that was really what was going on. Now the coolest thing about that for us is that those applications work on OS 2 because they're all written using JavaScript and Zool. They're cross-platform. So that's kind of cool. So the Zool Runner technology, as it evolves, is actually going to be beneficial from our perspective, because people might write these applications that they designed to be on Windows or Linux, and they'll just happen to work on OS 2 because usually they don't have native code involved. So that's kind of cool. So those technologies, I think, in the long run will really help what we do.
Do people actually write applications in that environment, that Zool?
Do people write applications in that environment? I've written applications in that environment. Actually, they do. I'm working on something called the Client Customization Kit, which lets you configure the browser. It's written using Zool Runner. There are, I think somebody's written Pac-Man using Zool Runner. So basically, everybody is looking forward to this next release of Firefox 1.5, which is coming out hopefully towards the end of this year. Is going to be the first platform that officially ships this Zool Runner as like something they want everybody to use. I think that's when you'll start to see things happening. Actually, one of the more interesting apps that's been written using Zool technology, although not Zool Runner specifically, but to give you an idea of what you can do, is there's this company called, I don't know the company name, but it's a product called Simo Health, S-I-M-O-H-E-A-L-T-H, Simo Health. What this product is it's an application that you use to keep track of when you go to the doctor and the bills that you pay. It's basically a personal inventory for all your doctor visits, so you can track when your insurance pays and when your insurance doesn't pay. It's actually a really cool app, but what's most interesting about it is that it's totally written using Mozilla. And when you go to install it and you watch the things that are getting installed, what you'll find is that it's actually installing Mozilla behind the scenes, and it's all written in Zool. And this guy wrote this really cool application using Mozilla technology behind the scenes. So that's a good example. There's also an educational application to do geometry and math that was written using Zool. It uses MathML. It uses SVG as well. So there are people taking this technology to the next level. There aren't very many standalone Zool Runner apps yet because Mozilla hasn't shipped a platform to make those apps available. And that's really what you're going to see at the end of this year. And they're even going to convert like Firefox to be a Zool Runner app. So you would install Zool Runner, and then you would say Zool Runner space Firefox, and it would run Firefox. Because actually, Firefox is just a little kind of veneer on top of Zool Runner itself, is what it will boil down to in the end. So, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Great. Yeah. So later on today, I think it's at 3:30, right? 3:30 today. There's a tips and tricks of Mozilla, and that's going to show some Zool Runner stuff that you guys want to see sometime. Yeah.
I've thought for years that anything which was a static application, such as an encyclopedia or any reference work, should be a browser-native application. So that you write it once and it runs on anybody's PC. If something is written in Zool Runner, let's say, and somebody wanted to write an encyclopedia or reference or whatever, will they be able to take that CD and load it on any operating system, any PC?
Okay, the question was, if somebody wrote like an encyclopedia or something using the Zool Runner technology, would it work on any PC? The answer is it depends on the technology that you use behind the scenes. As long as you're using Zool and JavaScript and all the languages that are not platform specific like C++ and C, then yes, you can create an application that ran on any. As a matter of fact, in France, there's actually an encyclopedia that's shipped by a company in France that's written using Zool that does work on multiple platforms because that's exactly how they wrote it. So yes, that's absolutely what this technology will allow, is that you can write applications that will run anywhere. They're browser-based in the sense that they can use the browser to do all their rendering. I mean, that's the beauty of it, is anybody that's done development for any length of time, I mean, doing text output to the screen is like the biggest pain in the world to start with, where you try to figure out how to make your text output. So if I can have a browser render all my text for me and take care of the wrapping for me and all that kind of stuff, I'm like way ahead of the game already. So this idea that I can, use the browser to create all the controls, and I can use the browser to do all the layout, and then I can just use JavaScript to tie everything together. It's a great programming model, and I mean, what I've done in it is very simple, but I can show it to you guys. So I'm going to, now that my notes are done up here, give me 1 second to switch back to mirroring my screen so I can stop straining my neck. So one of my projects that I'm working on is something called the Client Customization Kit. So when you run Firefox inside of IBM, you get, it says Firefox IBM Edition, and I've changed the icon, and I've added some items there, and you can go to help, and you can select IBM help, and it'll take, so we've customized the browser for use with IBM. And to do that, we wrote a Zool runner app. So this is all written using Zool and JavaScript. Zool has built-in wizards, so I was able to write my wizard. There was no extra code for making the wizards happen. Zool has built-in code for doing things like displaying images. So these images that display, I just create an image tag and tell Mozilla where to get the image, it displays it. So basically I was able, my first version of this application came up in probably about an hour or two. And then I'm using JavaScript for all my file I/O, so I can then, when it's done, it actually writes all the files to disk using JavaScript. So there's no native code that actually goes in. Obviously, this is a very simple application, but with Zool, you have things like tree controls and all kinds of things that when you do it natively, you have to do a lot more work to make it happen. Whereas inside of Zool, you get a lot of it for free. So anyway, okay. Anybody have any more questions?
What about Flash? Is that ever going to be upgraded to?
Flash.
I think we're back to lawyers,
Are you guys going to update Flash again, or?
there was this legal problem. The license that is out, and you would argue that I was doing Windows on the past. We could figure it out.
So yeah, in my heart of hearts, Flash goes away because I just don't like Flash. But I think there are much better web-based technologies for doing the kind of things that Flash does on the web, and things like SVG, and so maybe we'll see a day where there won't need to be Flash, but I don't know. It affects the people to handle that. Yeah.
Is any development for OS2
OS2 Lightning. There is some work going to make sure the OS2 calendar works. Again, Andy and Peter have done some work on that. I haven't checked in I still haven't checked in the header change, and there's an update to SQLite. The answer is that code should just work on OS2. Once we get the right changes in, again, most of it is Zool code, so it's just going to be cross-platform. So you shouldn't run into a lot of problems with that, but absolutely, our goal is to have the calendar in. When Lightning ships, we will, we have to do a custom version for OS2 because we don't have all our OS2 changes in the tree, we'll do that. But yeah, absolutely. The biggest problem we have right now on OS2 in Mail is the stupid repaint problem that I've got to find some time to debug, which is that when you use a current version of Thunderbird, all your clicks are off by 1 because of a painting problem. But I tried to debug it once, it was very, very painful. So
If you resize the window.
yeah, you can resize the window. We've got a little hack we can throw in the code that basically fakes the resize in the code. Which again, I might as well throw that in the, I'm gonna do the 1.5 beta 2 of Thunderbird when I get home. And so maybe I'll just throw that hack in there, so at least it's usable. So. Okay.
How long is this, I almost say nonsense, of having CMonkey suite and these separate products going down different tracks? I mean, that's a coordination problem.
Okay.
To me, it looks
Here's the,
ridiculous.
so the question was the CMonkey Firefox Thunderbird thing, you know, how long are we gonna have to play with this? You know what, the answer is forever. See, so you basically have, in the open source world, you have this problem, which is, you can call it a problem, it's a good thing and a bad thing, which is that people can make these decisions on their own. And so Mozilla decided, you know what, people don't want the suite. And I understand where they're coming from, because I'll be honest, I've been doing this for 9 years. And the one message that came to me for 9 years from everybody I talked to was, I just want the browser. I don't want all this other stuff. So when Mozilla finally did just the browser, I was like, cool, just the browser. And everybody came out and said, no, we want everything. It's like, so, I mean, for my purposes, you know, I work for a company that makes mail clients, and I work for a company that makes, you know, web development tools. So the idea of having just the browser, that's a great thing that I can give to my customers because I'm not giving them competing products along the way, right? So, but the community decided they want the suite. So what you're going to see for the foreseeable future is that this CMonkey group, do I have a hard stop at 30 minutes, or is there a break in the middle? Is my stop a hard stop, or is there a break in between?
There's another session
Okay.
that starts
I'll knock over. I need 2 minutes in the end to talk to you guys about something. Okay, so for the foreseeable future, you'll see both. CMonkey, if you've installed it, before you stop laughing at the graphics that they've placed into CMonkey. It's basically just the old suite with really crappy graphics thrown in, because they're placeholders until they get the new ones done. Yeah, and the thing is, CMonkey has a more active development environment in the sense that because it's not owned by Mozilla anymore, they're free to put, you know, the kitchen sink in if they want to do it. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad. And in the long run, that's what boiled down to this split, which is some people believe that the kitchen sink should go in the browser, and some people believe that the browser should just be about the most simple things for surfing the web. Now, the sad part is that every so often somebody tries to throw their kitchen sink into Firefox, which actually happened like a month ago, where somebody tried to throw, it was an RSS extension that I don't remember the name of, and it quickly got pulled out, and everybody realized, okay, we're going down the wrong route, we need to back this out. So, basically, from my opinion, is if you want a simple web browser that does the basics of what you need, Firefox is the name to use. And if you use Firefox, Thunderbird will be your mail client. Once CMonkey looks a little more polished, honestly, I can't use the thing just because the icon just, I mean, it just drives me crazy. I can't believe somebody would even put that in as a joke, because it's just not funny. It's not, I mean, it's kind of sad.
Can't you write a class that overrides the icon?
You can install something to override the icon, but it just, if I were trying to launch my new thing and get everybody excited about it, I wouldn't start it out like that, you know.